I remember a number of years back, there was a computer game in the early days of computer games. It was called SimCity, and it allowed players to build civilizations from the ground up. As a player, you could build roads, water supplies, industrial precincts, and as your city grew, this would attract workers whose taxes would allow you to continue to build your civilization. You'd raise armies, you'd conquer the world. However, if you failed to provide adequate infrastructure, community sentiment would go sour, residents would leave, civilizations would collapse. Then, as a player, you'd have to start all over again. Now, with Australia's population likely to grow to close to 40 million people by 2040, or the middle of the century anyway, to a degree, this is what could happen in the real world. So is Australia going to adequately provide infrastructure for our significant population growth? And if not, what would that mean to our standard of living here? What would it mean to our property markets? So, whether you're a property investor wanting to understand how the future of Australia's development and infrastructure is going to influence demand on housing, or whether you're a business owner needing to understand what's ahead, I'm sure at the end of today's show you'll have more clarity from the insights of my special guest, Ross Elliot. So, welcome to today's show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
There's so much to be grateful for about living in Australia, but that doesn't mean we can be complacent. So what are the most important qualities of a livable city? While a lot of factors are important, infrastructure, including social infrastructure such as schools and hospitals, they probably rank amongst the top factors. And as our population grows, and it surely will, this will place increasing demand on our infrastructure, and maybe we won't even be able to keep up. Of course, it's much more than just getting stuck in the traffic or wedged in overcrowded public transport just to get where you want to get to. Well, that's according to my guest today, Ross Elliot. Ross has spent close to 30 years in the real estate and property roles, including as State Executive and Chief Operating Officer of the Property Council of Australia, as well as the National Executive of the the Residential Development Council. He's Chair of the Lord Mayor's Better Suburbs Institute. I could go on and on about a lot of things, but Ross, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's always a pleasure.
Well, what I was getting at is your depth of understanding of the property market. And currently, look, we're experiencing a housing shortage around Australia. Vacancy rates are at record lows. Rents are rising. There's queues of people lining up to rent accommodation. And look, we're even seeing posts on social media of people needing to live in caravan parks or in tents. And with little new accommodation in the pipeline, I can only see the situation getting worse, and it's going to be exacerbated by that big increase in permanent migration that was lifted recently to 195 people per annum. Now, that's, of course, to address the skills shortage, the labour shortage, that's holding back our economy, but it's going to create some issues for our property markets. Recently, you wrote that the housing shortage is actually the least of our worries, Ross.
Well, I said that because we tend to obsess about population numbers and housing, and particularly obsess about housing in the three largest capital cities. And what we don't spend a lot of time and attention on, Michael, is the consequences of population growth. So you would know, as many of us do who are in the property industry, that there's a great cheer squad for population growth. It's seen as something that simply underpins real estate values, underwrites future growth. It's been called a Ponzi scheme by people who aren't terribly supportive of it, but generally the whole property industry will say this is a marvellous thing. What they don't take into account, though, is that there are consequences of that growth, and sometimes those consequences can lead us to be living in cities or suburbs of those cities where the quality of life and the standard of living is actually deteriorating through congestion, lack of access to hospital space, lack of access to schools, and so on it goes.
Sure. So does that mean we're going to have to rethink our town planning policies? Because I guess we're going to have to live in more high and medium density accommodation like they do overseas if we're going to what is it, 1 million people in the next 5 years, at least, plus all the students coming in, plus our natural population growth.
Yeah. Well, I think, yes, we do need to rethink the current crop of planning policies that most major capital cities share common DNA. And that was simply about the need to constrain growth within what are called urban growth boundaries. And that was fine. It was a great theory. It was started off in about the late 1990s. The consequence of that was we were promised many things. I still recall the plan for metropolitan Sydney, which was launched promising more affordable homes and shorter commutes. That was 20 years ago. So you'd have to say on some of these metrics, it's been a dismal failure, and any other business would revisit the assumptions. I think one of our problems, Michael, is that the planning policy at the moment seems content to keep cramming very large numbers of people into primarily two or three capital cities, each of which is ring-fenced by an urban growth boundary, and where the strategy for accommodating that growth is largely simply a housing strategy, and it simply says we just need more density of housing. And in most of those cities, they're not addressing the other consequences of growth, because planning, I don't know that planning does this very well. They talk about demography and housing form and housing type and housing location, but the nature of jobs and where they are and how people get to those jobs and how they access services and the number of services they need is something that we're starting to fall well behind on.
Well, there's the other side of things, of course, because local councils are very much involved in town planning, and in many ways they're trying to appease local residents concerned about road congestion, traffic problems, or damaging the neighbourhood characters. You know, the NIMBYs, it's not in my backyard, and the notes, not over there either.
Yes, that's true. And all of that is true, all right? All of that is true. However, let me ask you this question. Can you think of any jurisdiction where the community was asked to vote on whether they want this scale and speed of population growth in their neighbourhood, and whether they have said, yes, we want high density housing? Has that ever gone to a popular vote? I'd suggest it hasn't, and it's understandable in many respects that the community aren't all that persuaded, because they're seeing the adverse consequences. And that's what we've got to address. If we're going to bring the community along with us, we've got to have some pretty convincing arguments around those adverse consequences. And just right now, I don't think we do.
Okay, but aren't we requiring more skilled migrants, especially in our major cities, because we don't have enough people in the healthcare system, in the aged care system, in the childcare system, the sort of jobs that, to be blunt, most Australians don't want to do?
Yes and no. I mean, I think I'll just go back to my earlier point, is that we're cramming most of the growth into the largest cities, the three largest, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and that's where these shortages are the most acute. They are there as well in regional centres. I do get that. What we don't have is, if you like, we don't have a national approach to settlement. We don't really think hard about how we disperse economic activity out of those three cities, create a lot more geographic resilience in the process. We don't particularly well understand what the magnets of attraction are for business and residents. If they were considering some of the mid-sized regional cities across the country, what does it take to position them for organic growth in the future? All of these are valid questions, and they should be things that we're debating, but it seems that we just simply go back to, let's pump another couple of 100,000 people into three capital cities on a per annum basis, and that'll underpin real estate markets and give us some cheap labour in the process. That, to me, seems about the extent of our quality of discussion.
Well, when reading your detailed blog, I learned something, because I guess my thought was we're bringing skilled migrants in, which would be people who are got above average wages, but in fact that's not the case. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, well, it's not. I think the Productivity Commission or one of those recent inquiries acknowledged that the new migrants, they bring skills, but they're not highly skilled. So we're not talking about people who'll be inhabiting offices of our CBD office buildings.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody anymore?
Well, only, and certainly not on Monday and Friday, apparently. No. So we're not talking about level of professional qualification. We're talking about a lower level of professional qualification, and quite often these people arrive with limited capital, so they're going to immediately, be dependent on public health, on public education, on a whole range of the provision of public services, and that's fine. But the first consequences of that growth will be a greater drain on the extent of public services that we offer. They're not going to have private health insurance, and they're not going to be driving Teslas. I'll put it that way, Michael.
Okay, so similarly, as you said, they're not going to be working in the CBDs. And another interesting thing I learned from your writings over the years is that, in fact, most of the jobs are not in the CBDs, they're in the suburbs. And when you think about it, that makes sense. They're in the shops and in the schools and in the kindergartens and the childcare centres. So a lot of these people are not going to want to live right near the CBD, and they're going to be living in areas where maybe the infrastructure isn't as good, won't be able to cope, and I guess the public transport isn't going to cope too well either.
Well, no, you're quite right. The greatest number of jobs are actually outside CBDs and inner cities. So depending on the city, it's about 85% of the jobs are non-central. The challenge that public transport has is that it's mostly designed to service centralised jobs. So people in professional occupations who work in CBDs, either as office workers or they might even be students at universities. But if it's a CBD location, it can work for public transport. But if 85% of the people are living in suburban homes and they wake from a suburban bed and they need to get to their suburban place of work, the motor vehicle, the private car, is almost the only alternative. It's not that they choose to or they love it or anything like that. It is the most efficient, cost-efficient, time-efficient alternative available, because public transport really struggles with small cross-city, suburb-to-suburb connections.
That's one of the problems we have here, that they're probably a bit better at overseas with their rings. So if these people are now going to be moving to the suburbs, and in fact the outer suburbs, and if we believe that Australia's got a business plan of growing to up to 40 million people by the middle of the century, and Melbourne, Sydney, southeast Queensland are all going to have maybe 1.5 million more people, what's going to happen to the road systems? Because I know that you've written that for every 100,000 people, we need probably an extra 60, 70,000 more cars on the road. And that makes sense when you have a look at how many cars each family's got.
Well, that's right. So the rule of thumb is that for every, let's say the politicians and the real estate industry, when they're spruiking the next million people, whichever city is the subject of that, my question would be, all right, well, that's at least 600,000 more cars. That's the ratio of cars to population. And my question would be, what's our plan for that? And there doesn't seem to be much of a plan at all, given that we're going to put those vehicles on largely the same amount of road space that we had 15 years ago, when many of our cities were half the population they are now. So what we're noticing is congestion is increasing a lot. It will increase further if we continue to put more people into mainly the three capitals without a commensurate plan to deal with mobility. So the consequence of that is going to be you can only travel so far in 15 minutes, and the distance you can travel in 15 minutes, half an hour, whatever it's convenient, will get less. So in 10 or 15 years' time, another million people arrives in your city. There's another 600,000 vehicles on the road, all trying to fight for the same amount of lane space that was there 20 years ago. Guess what? You won't be going quite as far as you used to. Now, that, I think, creates some opportunities in the real estate game for people to think smart about what does that therefore mean. And to me, it means people are going to be thinking much harder about accessing the services they want and need much closer to where they live. The idea of travelling right across the city or travelling quite some kilometres to access healthcare or education or something else is going to become simply impossible for many people because it'll take too long.
Well, it brings us back to that 20-minute neighbourhood theory, but is 20 minutes neighbourhood going to be the same? You're not going to get as far in 20 minutes.
Well, exactly, yeah. So it brings everything closer to home, which means potentially the idea of the local village, the old local high street, if you like, it's been overlooked and forgotten for the best part of 30 years because we've largely been obsessed with inner cities. It may come into its own again.
I can understand that. So we know that the public transport system isn't ready to cope. The road system isn't ready. But we started off talking about us living in these fantastic livable cities, the most livable cities in the world, even though Melbourne, my hometown, has lost that mantle, and we sort of know why with COVID. But there are other issues as well. How's the healthcare system going to cope, Ross?
Well, yeah, that is a challenge. As I said before, that the healthcare system that attracts the most negative headlines is the public health and hospital system, and it seems that almost every city has an issue with ramping of ambulances and limited quality of care and falling number of beds per 1,000 head of population. In fact, I saw some figures recently that suggested that the ratio of public hospital beds to population fell very markedly from around about late 90s, early 2000s, which is also about when our rate of population growth increased very significantly, and we stopped building lots of new hospitals. That's another indicator. I don't know what it's like in Sydney or Melbourne, but I know here in Brisbane, the tales of woe in the health system are there almost every second night, if not every night. And you feel for policymakers and governments, but at the same time, I go back to the point is we can't keep applauding another 50,000 people a year crossing interstate boundaries that come to live in Queensland, and isn't this marvellous, without realising that they're generating a demand for beds in hospitals and many other things as well. So, it's a moot point whether the growth is actually achieving improved quality of life, if what it's actually doing is meaning that essential services like hospitals are struggling to keep pace.
Well, you're right, not just where you are in Queensland, but back here in Melbourne as well. Every night there's something on the news about people who've waited a long time for ambulances or sat in the emergency department because there were no beds. So there's partly it's labour related at the moment, but it's also infrastructure related. There's not enough hospitals. But we've got an election coming up this year, so all of a sudden hospitals are on the agenda here in Melbourne. But when we last spoke, we also talked about the school system coming under pressure because we're going to have to be able to provide for all these students. And where are they going to build all the schools? We got rid of a lot of schools a while ago.
Well, and another consequence, of course, of putting more people into the square mile, which is lifting the rates of density in our major cities, is that those people also require places for their kids to go to school. And every extra million people on the rough formula is another 160,000 odd students. And if you took an average school of 400 students, there's another 400 schools for every million extra. Now, where do you put a new school? Because most of our cities are largely built out now. The traditional school probably required 7 to 10 hectares of land for sporting ovals, and typically was low density, low height. Now, those sites don't exist. I noticed in New South Wales, the Education Department are looking at including schools as a use within mixed-use precincts that might be developed by private developers. So I think that's a very clever idea. We're going to see similar approaches taken in other cities as we struggle with the big question of where do we find room for new schools. Perhaps, Michael, some of the empty office buildings in our CBDs, which are very well served by public transport, could be converted to high-rise schools.
That's an interesting thought, yes. But we're also noticing energy problems. How's the energy grid going to cope?
Well, I guess we're going to find out soon, aren't we? We'll be told that air conditioners at the height of summer shouldn't be turned on past 27 degrees or something insane. Look, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that some of the energy regulators have cautioned that we are heading for shortages because the rate at which we've closed down coal-fired power stations and we haven't had the replacement sustainable energy sources ready to fill in the gap, that could cause issues. Now, that affects the grid right across the country. Of course, that doesn't really apply. It's not a consequence, of higher density in the capital cities at all. But it's one of those other infrastructure issues that the more people there are and the more industry there is, the more we're going to demand energy. And we have to have a plan to provide it. And, I'm not sure that plan really stacks up terribly well right now either.
Well, I also read in one of your blogs that there's a potential of a shortage of drinkable water.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I sound like such a bearer of bad news, and I'm not. I guess the reason we're flagging these things, Michael, is that it's one thing to talk about, oh, look, all of these people are arriving, we need houses for them. But guess what? We also need to provide potable water. Now, in the case of Brisbane, the warnings have been issued by, I think it was SEQ Water, that in a number of years at the rates of population growth predicted at the moment that we're going to run short of potable water because we haven't built any new dams. And the irony is, of course, that if the solution then becomes, oh, well, we'll put a desal plant off the coast, well, at the moment, those desal plants are massively energy hungry. They consume a lot of energy. And if our energy grid is going to be short of power, I don't know why we're going to get the drinking water. So, whether it's schools or whether it's the energy grid or whether it's hospitals or whether it's the roads we drive upon to get from, where we live to where we need to be, all I guess I'm saying is that housing is only just one part of it. And really, housing should be the easiest.
Now, before people get too negative about this, I know you're not a negative person. I know you're a positive person, and I know you've got very detailed knowledge of what's happening in our housing markets and infrastructure. So I know all this is coming with the best intent to make us aware of problems before they occur so that we can do something about it. Well, some people, Ross, would say, hey, but technology has always caught up and done the right things. What about autonomous cars, electric vehicles? Maybe I'll just hop into whatever the Uber is of the future and it'll drive me around and there won't even be a person driving me.
Well, I think that's entirely possible. And in fact, I think we should be working towards planning for it now. But I'm not seeing a lot of transport thinking devoted to a future of autonomous electric travel, shared electric vehicles, shared small format public transport, electric autonomous vehicles, etc. It seems to me that our politicians and some of the industry groups are still harping on about the sort of solutions that were designed for monocentric cities of the 1960s through to the 1980s and 90s, which is all about let's build more commuter trains to shuffle people from outer suburbs to CBDs, ignoring the fact that census after census reveals that only 10 to 15% of the total population work in the CBDs and can be serviced by that public transport spend. The rest of us are going to need to work out how to get around. And the idea of autonomous electric vehicles is a good one, but how many transport agencies are actively exploring how that might look and how it might be deployed across our road network?
I guess we could always get on those little scooters that everybody's driving around at the moment and leave them on the next corner. So, Ross, to put it in perspective, our projected growth of our three large cities by world standards is very ambitious, isn't it? It's actually bigger than any other Western city. Would that not be right?
It is. In fact, I was at one of the larger commercial agencies invited me on a panel recently to talk about the Olympics, which is coming to Brisbane, of course. And they noted that Brisbane's rate of growth in the next 15 years was equivalent to the percentage rate of growth, or slightly ahead, in fact, of Beijing or Shanghai. And being the real estate agents they were, that this was a marvellous thing until...
Exciting, yes. Look at all the properties I can sell or the offices I could lease.
That's it, Russian blood to the head. Anyway, I said, well, I don't know that this is really a good thing at all because our history is that we're not even terribly good at growing slowly. So if we are now proposing that we're going to grow faster than Beijing or Shanghai, that's not a democratic country. Communist China can just do things, and they do, and people just disappear. There is no opportunity for dissent, and their standards of safety and the whole range of other things mean that, the way they do things there is not the way we really want to be doing things in this country. I think we'll leave it at that. So comparing our growth, or just the reality that we're trying to grow faster than a city like Beijing, which I think both Beijing and Shanghai have populations, each of them close to the total population of Australia.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
So it is unbelievable. Yeah.
So I guess another solution then, Ross, would be to make better use of the existing infrastructure. Would that be a fair suggestion?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a very good suggestion. So I would extend that to making better use of some of the infrastructure opportunities that aren't in the three major capitals. I'd be inclined to spend a lot more time focused on some of the other capitals, but also the regional cities across the country, and making sure that they are provided with the sort of infrastructure, social infrastructure, placemaking, amenity, etc., that the major cities take for granted. So that, well, I'll take a Ballarat, all right, just off the top of my head, let's take Ballarat. I believe that's going to double its population in the next 20 years or something like that, which numerically is not a huge number. I think it's going from 80 to 160,000 or 60 to 120, something like that. But if that is to happen, there ought to be plans now from the federal government and the state government to ensure that somewhere like Ballarat has a plan for delivery of the level of hospital care, quality hospital care, not just the regional hospital where you're parked temporarily before you're shuttled off to the capital city hospital. Quality of healthcare, quality of education, including tertiary, are two major drivers, certainly across the US and parts of Europe in terms of where people choose to live and also where employers choose to go. So this is really planning for 10, 20, 30 years down the track. And how do we equip those regional cities with the sort of infrastructure that means that, they're going to continue to be attractive and they can take some of the growth pressure off the major capitals, perhaps, and they can share in some of the spoils of growth, provided, we make sure the infrastructure is kept up to speed as well.
Well, lots of challenges for our governments, our urban planners, our town planners, and for those people in the property industry. But let's hope they get it right, because we are living in the best place in the world and really at the best time in history. So let's hope they don't spoil it for us. Ross, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Ross Elliot, and in a moment I'm going to be sharing my mindset message with you. But I guess one of the messages I got from my chat with Ross is that even though we're living in the best country in the world, we've got to be careful that we don't spoil it as we grow. I'm sure, though, that our governments are going to keep growing our population because it's the most effective way of keeping the tax dollars in. Remember, as all the baby boomers retire, and the recent budget has shown us that the health budget's going to blow out, they're going to require more taxpayers. And the best way to get those is people who are skilled labourers who are going to pay tax because they don't use as much of the health system or the school system. So our population is going to grow. Let's hope our town planners do the right thing. I think the other point was neighbourhood's going to be very important. But remember, I've often spoken about that 20-minute neighbourhood. I guess the 20-minute neighbourhood is going to be even more important to be close by, because you won't get as far in 20 minutes in 10, 15 years' time. As a property investor, you've got to think about the long-term future. So in my mind, what is going to drive property values in the long term is demographics, much more than the ups and downs of interest rates or this month's latest government policies, because how many of us there are, how we want to live, where we want to live is going to be critical. And also the wealth of the nation, because as long as we are wealthy, we're going to be able to afford to live in those places. So I guess the property markets are going to be more fragmented moving forward. And that's why it's really important to have this sort of background research, because I know a lot of people want to get the next hotspot or buy a bargain now. That's short-term thinking. It's important to own quality assets that are going to help build your asset base over the long term to give you choices in life later on. So quality of assets is important, because remember, the ability for your tenants to pay you more rent in the future is going to be what's going to underpin your lifestyle in the future. So that's why demographics is one of the big factors that we research at Metropole. So if you want to understand where to invest and how to invest, what areas are going to overperform and underperform, where to look, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole, because we can provide you with time-tested, proven frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for over 20 years. We've invested through difficult times like this before, but we've also seen the changes, and we have tweaked some of our concepts and ideas. We've had to, as the world has changed. Oh, by the way, we've recently won 3 different international awards, including Most Trusted Investment Consultancy Company in Australia in 2022 and Best Property Investment Consultants in Australia in 2022. So if you're interested in property, whether it's an investment or your own home, go to metropole.com.au, find out about our range of services and click and leave your details. And let's have an obligation-free complimentary clarity consultation to see what your options are. I'll leave a link in the show notes.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to explain to you about a chat I had with one of my nephews who suddenly is taking an interest in property and business and success. And he said, what would you have liked to know years ago that would make things different today? Now, that's a great question. And as I discussed things with him, I realized that the topics I was talking about really wasn't as much about property or money as it was about mindset. So these are some of the things I mentioned to him that I wish I had known then. And the first one was to become the pilot of your life, because then everything is going to change. I remember things changed for me when I learned that my thoughts lead to my feelings lead to my actions, and my actions lead to my results. This meant that my inner world, my thoughts and my feelings, controlled my outer world, my actions and my results. The turning point was when I realized that I was responsible for all things, the good and the bad that had happened to me. I then became the pilot of my life and not just a passenger. I also realized that even if it's not true, I know I act differently and my results are better because I believe I'm responsible for everything that happened to me. The second lesson I told Daniel was that when I was young, no one taught me about this thing called the reticular activating system, that part of the brain that only lets you see in your surroundings what you focus on in your thoughts. It pretty much always helps you find what you're looking for. You know that story that if you were going to look for a white Toyota, you were going to buy a new car, all of a sudden on the street you'd see white Toyotas everywhere. It's the reticular activating system that looks for things that you focus on and blocks out other things. It pretty much always helps you find what you're looking for. It's your inbuilt GPS system. And so what I learned, and I would have liked to know it earlier in life, was the importance of setting goals and regularly reviewing them, because it's one way to keep your focus. It keeps you focused on what's important and helps you take actions that are going to move you closer towards where you want to go. The other lesson I told him was that your attitude changes your reality. It's that old glass half full or glass empty story. When things happen in life, things that we don't like, we can either choose to see them as a problem or as a solution waiting to be discovered. Now, to be blunt, it took me quite some time in my life to discover that if you change your attitude, you can actually change your reality. When you have a positive attitude instead of a negative one, you start to see things and viewpoints that were invisible before. At the moment, there's lots of challenges going on in the world, in life, but there always seem to be. But the optimistic people do much, much better in life in general than the pessimists. Another lesson I told him was the importance of giving. You've got to give to receive. As children, we're told that the joy is in giving rather than receiving. But as adults, for many of us, life becomes about what we can get out of somebody or something. However, if you want to increase the value you receive, look, it could be money, love, kindness, opportunities. You've got to increase the value that you give, because over time, what you get is in proportion to what you give out. While it would be nice to get something for nothing, over the years I learned that seldom happens. Another lesson I taught him was to be proactive rather than reactive. There seems to be three types of people out there: those who make things happen, those who watch what happens, and then there's those who sit around and say, hey, what just happened? Be in the first group. Be in that group of people who make things happen, and always be on the lookout for opportunity. Two more lessons I gave him that I'd like to share with you. One is make your time count. How often have you heard people say time flies? Well, indeed it does, so use it wisely. Just as you're careful about how and where you invest your money, you should be careful about how you invest your time. Remember the Pareto principle, that 80-20 rule? It says that 80% of the value we receive comes from 20% of what we do with our time. So what things do you do? What do you spend your time doing that takes a lot of energy yet delivers few results? Cut those out and use your time wisely. Of course, that also means don't waste your time worrying, because most things you're worrying about are never going to happen. They're just monsters in your mind. If they do happen, they're most likely not going to be as bad as you expected. So now when you're confronted with a challenge, what you should do is put things in perspective. What I ask myself is, what's the worst that could happen? What's the best possible outcome? And what's the most likely thing that's going to happen? This means you shouldn't take things too seriously, because that which seems like a really big problem today, you may not even remember in 5 years' time. So lighten up a little bit. But the other lesson I taught him was mistakes mean growth. Sometimes negative experiences, mistakes and failures can be an even better way of achieving success, because they teach you something that another win, another success probably wouldn't teach you. However, we're so driven with getting things right that we fail to see the value when things go wrong. Instead, we spend our time wishing we'd done it differently, or not doing anything because we're scared of having a mistake. So if things go wrong, learn from your mistakes is what I explained to him. Make it count. Do things differently next time. What I didn't tell him at the time, but I would have liked to, was one thing I'm going to share with you now, and that's don't compare yourself to others. That's one of the things I would have liked to know early too, because when you compare yourself to others, you let the outside world control how you feel about yourself. Clearly, with social media now and seeing everybody's what they eat and what they do and their cars and their lifestyle, it makes some people feel a little bit jealous. Remember, you're seeing people's highlight reels, not all the bits on the cutting room floor. So instead of trying to compare yourself with other people, strive to be the best that you can be, and look at how far you've come, what you've achieved, what you've accomplished. And they're the lessons that I would have liked to know many years ago. And if I've shared them with you and now you're aware of those, maybe it will help you just get that bit of success a little bit sooner. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?